I'm really delighted to welcome all of you here to this amazing, amazing room, my favourite place in North Oxford. I think it has a certain degree of magic about it that came before Hogwarts, actually. We are, rather ironically, going to spend our evening talking about technology in one of the oldest rooms in the university. And we're doing so because tonight is the 6th event of our Oxford Internet Institute Internet and Society Awards. For those of you that have never come to these before, these are a great opportunity for us at the OII to celebrate the work of the amazing people who ensure that the internet is put to great public good and whose research helps us further that purpose. We'll be spending the final part of the evening giving those awards out, but I'm very, very lucky for us to have a chance to have, first of all, a public lecture, in fact, really a public in conversation with one of my own personal heroines, Professor Judy Wajcman. For those of you who have not had the chance to meet her before, I hope that the next hour is going to be instructive in why she is one of my heroines. But to give you a little bit of background, she, like me, she's a student of politics. You studied in Australia, didn't you, in Monash, and then went on to do a PhD, unfortunately, in the other place, but we don't hold that against you now. You were the first female fellow at St John's College, and I can't imagine what that's like, and I'm hoping you'll tell me after a glass of wine later, actually. I suspect that was quite tough. We're going to talk a little bit more about this shortly, but some of the work she's best renowned for is in two key areas that are relevant to the OII. So one is around helping us understand what we mean by the social shaping of technology, how are technologies designed, built, how do they interact with the societies around us, and also technology and gender, and we'll talk about both of those more shortly. You are currently the Anthony Giddens Professor of Sociology at the LSE, and perhaps even more importantly to us, a visiting professor at the OII. And yes, I can't tell you how wonderful it is to have you here tonight, and I shall be looking forward to seeing you get your award later on.
Thank you.
So, if we were to look back at your upbringing and your education, do you think you could identify any particular moment or year or set of circumstances which maybe sort of diverted you somehow towards this interest in technology and society?
Yes, I mean, a few things came together, really. I mean, I'm old enough, I should say, to have been politicised by Australia's involvement in the Vietnam War. So I went to anti-war demonstrations, and that taught me very quickly that there was a strong connection between technology and the military and warfare. And I then went to Sussex to do a master's in sociology, and the science policy research unit was there, and there was a fantastic group of people already then sort of thinking about science. And I remember there was a chap actually who died some years ago called Brian Easley who was running a course called The Sociology of Science, and he'd written a book called Fathering the Unthinkable, and it was all about the dropping of the bombs in Japan, and talking about how the scientists had celebrated, that evening when the bombs had been dropped, the scientists had all been out there, the designers, drinking, and because it had all been a great success, and then how those scientists reflected on their role in warfare. And in Britain already, for some years, there'd been this organisation called BUSRAS, which was the British Society for Social Responsibility of Science. So it was that scientists were already very aware of their responsibility in relation to the sort of technology that they were sort of designing and contributing to. And then, very fortunately, I did go to Cambridge just at the moment where what we now refer to as second wave feminism, but was for me just the women's movement. The women's movement was really taking off at that time. It was just a fantastic time to be there. I joined a women's collective that we set up, and it was women from all kinds of disciplines. And we set about critiquing every single discipline. We did feminist critiques of psychology and anthropology and, absolutely everything, and wrote a book and, taught a course that was very original at that time. And I wrote a PhD on a women's cooperative. And it's, again, hard to remember, but it was a period in Britain where there was a lot of trade union militancy. There were these great workers' occupations, and this group of women had this little factory in Norfolk, that was sewing a few shoes together, was going to be closed down. and the women occupied this factory and started running it themselves. And I originally went there because the women's movement were trying to get orders for these wretched shoes and bags and and someone, I remember in the street outside Heifers said to me, "Jude, you're spending all your time going up there, you might as well do your PhD on it." And so that was an interest in several things. It was an interest in industrial democracy and work, but I was also very interested in the connections between paid work and unpaid work. And at that time, there was very little recognition of housework and other kinds of work. And I remember going into the houses, often tied cottages actually, of these workers in Norfolk. And I designed a little time budget. This was before there were these things, and asked men and women to fill out on my little diary, how much housework they did, And to my amazement, some of the husbands, I remember one husband, when I had my little chart out, literally sort of looked at me and said in his broad, I can't do an East Anglian accent, his broad accent said to me, "I don't keep a dog and bark myself," he said to me. And, I went back to Cambridge and everyone in the senior dining room thought this was terribly funny. But, so we were then thinking about the domestic division of labour and the connections between sort of work and home.
And given what you were saying about the response in the senior common room, what was it like doing a thesis on that had a clear gender element to it in that university at that time?
Well, it was at a time when actually, I as well carried out very early research on women workers because sociology of work was not about women workers and no one was very interested in women workers. And I got this fellowship in St John's, and I was in fact put into the secretaries section. There were no men there, so the only place that they could give me an office was in the secretaries section because that was the only female toilet at that time in the college. And everyone, of course, because I sat there, assumed I was a secretary because I was in that section. So I find it very ironic now that when I go around and see loos are all sort of gender neutral now, I just smile to myself and think how this could have been such a crucial element at that point. But seriously, it was a very sort of quick initiation in being in sort of male-dominated institutions. And as I've had a very, fortunate career and I've been in elite institutions actually all my life, I have basically been in male-dominated institutions all my life. And decades later, I got the first research chair at the Research School of Social Science at the Australian National University and spent a year on every single appointment committee, promotion committee. I did that whole thing because there was equal opportunities legislation that meant one had to do that. So it was a quick lesson in being valued for perhaps not quite the right reason.
I rather wish, actually, just hearing those last comments as well, that Dame Stephanie Shirley were here. I think she particularly liked that comment about being made to sit in the secretary's pool while starting your fellowship at St John's. I think that would definitely ring a bell with her. I mean, obviously also it's nice to recognise how far we've come, particularly on a night where all of our award winners actually are women. That's always worth celebrating.
Yes, well, I had meant to say that actually, that it's incredibly recent. That's the main thing about it, that it's hard to sort of think back to how recent it was. 78, I think it was.
Yeah, maybe that's
recent for me.
I was going to say. Let's maybe move on to talk a little bit about some of your scholarship. I think, I can think of at least, 2 or 3 of your books that are certainly still on our reading lists as core texts. So maybe let's think about one of them, the social shaping of technology. Now, I'd really like to hear a bit more about what your motivations were for writing that. I mean, perhaps this is an example of, to me, a text that feels like it should have been written a long time before when you wrote it. So what were you reacting to? What made you write that at that moment?
My first job when I left Cambridge was at Edinburgh University, and some of you will know that Edinburgh University at that time was very well known for the science studies unit, and it's known as the sort of Edinburgh School, and they'd actually developed what's known as the Sociology of Scientific Knowledge, SSK. So they were doing that work already, and David Edge, who'd been a BBC science correspondent, had gone up there, I think actually in the 60s, and was very keen on overcoming the sort of CP snow divide between science and humanities. And what we'd sort of discussed very early on was putting on a course for engineers. This was absolutely a book and a course for engineers. I remember Donald Mackenzie and I looking at various articles and thinking what to put in and thinking what would, have sort of resonance for engineers. And, I've just been in Stanford for a year and they're introducing compulsory sort of ethics courses for their computer scientists. And I said to one of the main people there, was asking me about my thing. I said, oh, yes, we were discussing teaching engineers then. And lovely woman, Roberta Katz, actually, just said to me, really, did you think of doing it all? I said, yes, actually, we were sort of absolutely trying to do it then because we thought it was kind of very important to broaden out designers' education because designers actually make the world we live in, and we knew that. And so, that's what it came out of.
And so the selection of essays that went into it, they were chosen then, were they, for their ability to speak to that audience?
They were, but in fact it's kind of Marxist origins are clear if you look at it in the sense that it's organised in 3 sections, and the 3 sections of production, which I was very interested in. Reproduction was where I put literally very few articles there were on gender and technology at that time. It was all I could find, and I popped them in there. And then there was a section on military technology. So that was how we sort of thought about those things at that time.
And in many ways, it seems to me that actually we still should be seeing that as a book that should have a much wider popular audience. We should still be talking about that collection of writing.
Yes, but maybe I can just say one more thing about it quickly, which was that, at that time already and always, I know for this audience it will be already and always, technological determinist arguments were everywhere, and we'd been through a microelectronic revolution where we were told actually that there'd be all this unemployment and de-skilling and it was inevitable, inexorable technological sort of progress. So we just thought, well, we'll just deal with this technologically determinist argument once and for all. We'll just kind of, deal with this, show the social origins of technology, and that will be that. And I never really thought we would still have to be doing this, and that it would be as important, if not more important, to keep making these points now, actually.
And recognising, obviously, that not everybody in this room is currently on an OII MSc course or teaching at the OII MSc. Could you maybe just summarise what the key tenet, or what is technological determinism, and what's your theory? What's the other theory? Why is it different?
Well, all of the focus was on the impact of technology on society, and people weren't really, what we were very simply trying to think about at the time was to turn the focus round and say, well, let's look at what social, cultural, economic values are shaping the technology itself. And we now talk about this in terms of the mutual shaping or co-constitution of society and technology. We have a whole sort of series of metaphors. We think about technologies as crystallized or frozen social relations. We have lots of different ways of talking about this, but it was basically just as the Edinburgh School had talked about how science was fundamentally social and cultural, that science wasn't something out there, objective and to be discovered, we were in a parallel way saying, well, actually, you get the kind of technology, actually, that the technology reflects the society you're in. So, when nasty things happen on the web, etc., I think to myself, well, I never did think that, that technology wasn't going to reflect the state of the culture.
At the same time, it still proves hard to us to grasp. I think we're still fixated, for example, about the concept of the heroic inventor, the way that we still laud, sort of the Silicon Valley and programmer culture, again, without recognising what the societal and cultural context is in which those technologies arise and how they build on what's gone before. Why do you think it's so hard for us to sort of understand this and really engage with this?
Well, I came in at the Thomas Kuhn movement, the structure of scientific revolutions, and then the Edinburgh School. And I think it's taken a very long time, actually, to get across them. If you think about the discussions of climate change or, any of the scientific controversies now, it seems like those old lessons about how actually, how important institutions are and social struggles and those concepts of Kuhn of normal science and the difficulty of shifting paradigms. The collective nature of these things is sort of endlessly denied, as are the kind of cultural importance of these things. So, I find even in the current debate about artificial intelligence that we need much more discussion about, the word artificial, the word intelligence, the fact that we talk about machine learning as if it's learning, you know, that all of these things. I mean, you know, I can remember when people started first talking about the brain being wired, you know, we're all wired, and I just thought, you know, what the hell is this new kind of metaphor? And I mean, you know, if you look back historically, we always kind of reinterpret how we think of ourselves in terms of current scientific metaphors, and we need to be sort of deconstructing those all the time. But your question about the individual, it's just sort of, what is that about? An individualistic society wanting to give individual authorship to things? I mean, if you think about the Bletchley Park example, how long it's taken to recognise how much that was a collective job. I mean, it was a job that involved a lot of women. I mean, all knowledge, not just scientific knowledge, is a collective process, a collective practice, and it's not an accident that lots of people are thinking about the same thing at the same time, but only if you get the Nobel Prize, you know.
I'm intrigued by what you were saying just now as well about artificial intelligence. So, you know, how might understanding the ways that technologies and societies shape each other, how might that help us better understand, for example, concepts like artificial intelligence or machine learning? I know there's something you have been thinking about a little bit.
Well, I must say I'm sort of very gratified by the fact that there are loads of fabulous gender analyses now coming out right at the point where these technologies are being developed. So whereas in the early days there were very few of us and it took us a long time to develop these things, I mean, if you look at, you know, here at the Data and Society group in New York, that there's loads of fantastic work being done about the social bias, gender bias, racial bias of kind of algorithms, predictive policing, all of these sort of things. And people are right onto it now. I think it's a huge kind of difference. And so that I feel very sort of much more optimistic about the social being there right at the beginning of these technologies being developed rather than it's taking us 20 years to catch up, in a way, if you know what I mean. But I think the other thing that maybe isn't said quite enough about the science and technology studies sort of perspective on these things is that, you know, one of the concepts we like, and forgive me for the, you know, how sociologists are with their concepts. I mean, we use this concept, technoscience imaginaries, yeah? And there's a sort of stream now of the sociology of expectations that's very much trying to talk about how a lot of the way science and technology is presented to us is partly sort of marketing, but not in the crude sense of marketing, that it's partly about defining the future. It's partly taking up the imaginative capacity to think about what are the possibilities of the future, yeah? I mean, is the future Alexis and Siri and apps and, you know, digital diaries and all these things I've been working on, or are there lots of other futures that we might be thinking of politically and socially that are somehow foreclosed by the ways in which these technologies are developed? So, you know, I think about the self-driving car rather than public transport. I think about robots for the elderly as I'm getting elderly, as opposed to having different kinds of housing so that you didn't segregate off people of different ages and then need a technological solution. I think about reconstructing the job of caring so it's paid better so that there isn't such a shortage of carers. I mean, there are all kinds of ways in which I think we need to always be kind of critically analysing the ways in which science and technologies of the future, and it's always the near now. You know, what's kind of interesting, it's always, it'll be in 10 years or 15 years, and we know as we watch this that the 10 years goes by and another, you know, there's always a kind of time trajectory in the predictions, yeah, of a particular, and it serves a kind of purpose in terms of marketing, political economy, all of these things, and we need to sort of be onto this, I think.
That's a really interesting question. I mean, it makes me wonder why particular visions of the future are chosen and who they're chosen by.
Well, we know who they're chosen by.
That's why I'm poking you to say it.
I mean, I've just spent a year in Silicon Valley because I wanted to be there on the ground and see how our futures are being defined and developed and talked about, you know, and I mean, I know lots of people work in this area, so, you know, but, you know, the bubble-like kind of culture is so true. I mean, I was just sort of really, I mean, I've written about this culture for years and years, and various people have said to me, you know, in a very flattering way that it's as if I had been there. Well, I had never been there, so I have just sort of spent a year there. And the business about sort of people working in corporations all day, you know, taking a bus to work, working in a corporation, spending all your time with particular people, living a particular lifestyle. I mean, it seems to me it's just kind of blatantly obvious that you're only going to get particular visions of a good life, of a good society, of good technology, if designers come from a kind of, you know, have got a limited life experience, to put it in its nicest manner, you know.
Very, very diplomatic. That's very good. Do you see any, I was going to say easy solutions. Clearly there are no easy solutions. Do you see any ways of ameliorating this situation, making us more self-aware of what visions of the future we're going to design into or market into our technologies?
Well, I think that's the work a lot of us are doing, and actually, you know, I'm sort of, you know, completely sort of honoured and delighted to be kind of sharing the prize with, you know, 3 other women who were doing sort of fantastic work in this space, who were actually kind of on-the-ground activists, making these spaces, redefining things. I mean, redefining what knowledge is. I mean, I wrote something on Wikipedia sort of at some point about that here was another form of knowledge, that it was again presented as being sort of objective and the truth, and it was again biased in particular ways. And now we're much more onto these things, you know, and things like Wikipedia make a huge difference because it's what people go to. It's represented as you know, the new encyclopedia, and so it's very important to make interventions in all of those kinds of ways, actually.
Yeah. Carrying on this particular strand of thought, maybe let's talk a little bit about techno-feminism, which I still think is one of the best book titles ever. Very jealous of you for that. Having had a look at it again in the last couple of days, it actually makes me realise how jaded I feel about life at the moment and about the way in which digital technologies seem to be playing out for lots of women and for individuals of cultures and backgrounds that are underrepresented. And I was really struck by the quite positive tone of the book, that this was, you know, you really felt there was a really strong potential here for these technologies to be used by feminists seeking to, you know, improve situations of social justice and bring about more equality and so on. So did you feel very positive at that moment, and do you maybe feel as positive now?
I mean, the truth is, you know, I had written this book in 1991 called Feminism Confronts Technology, which was my first attempt to write an overview of gender and technology. Much easier then to do, actually, very easy to do, because actually there was only a little bookshelf of women's studies books, and you could buy them all, and just, that was, you know, you literally could, you know, that was it in the early days. And that book was criticised, because it was still very kind of Marxist feminist, you know, some people criticised that book for being rather kind of negative, you know, that it was very much stressing the reproduction of, you know, gender relations and, you know, women were the victims of technology. I think unfair criticisms, I have to say, but there was that kind of tone. And things had shifted, actually. It was interesting that whereas the early work on gender and technology, I think, was rather pessimistic, you know, somehow along came cyborg feminism and cyber feminism and, you know, the bubble in Silicon Valley, and, you know, Haraway wrote her piece, and there was huge optimism, actually, about the possibilities that these new technologies would bring. And, you know, Sherry Turkle wrote her books about how, you know, we could be anybody in cyberspace, we could be men, women, thin, fat, you know. So it was a time when there was huge kind of optimism, and that, you know, that white-collar work, that they, you know, maybe there'd been some arguments about how mechanical work, you know, I mean, I'm still of the era of women in manual trades, right? You know, carpenters, women carpenters, plumbers, you know, that maybe if we were now in this era of white-collar work, that all these old gender relations would just be passé, and you know, and there was also a literature on kind of network organisations, and women are good at networking, and, you know, so there was generally a great optimism at that time. I mean, I guess what I would say now is that, you know, what I tried to do in that book, maybe not successfully enough, was to get past again what I thought would not be a big job, which was that a lot of the debates about technology are framed in terms of pessimism and optimism, you know, so it was always this, you know, this pessimism and, you know, and I thought, well, we'll just deal with that little problem as well, and just say, actually, that is not a very fruitful way engaging in these debates, and really what we need to do is, we're not going to reject technology, but we need to develop a good critical politics, and I mean politics and in addition to ethics, and that's a difficult issue, complicated issue as well, in terms of the design and deployment of these technologies, so that, I'm not optimistic or pessimistic.
Yeah.
I think it's about political intervention in these things, and I'm at the moment quite optimistic, given we're now going through third wave feminism, which was, it's a different time now, and I feel much more optimistic now actually than I would have felt I would have 5 years ago, I think.
Yeah. I'm glad we're giving this to you now then, rather than 5 years ago, definitely. Maybe let's move on to another strand of your work. So another area where I think you've produced great insights is around the research you've done around use of mobile phones, and in particular, how they enable both a new form of connectedness and yet also this sort of concept of perpetual contact, which I think is an interesting one. So, can you explain how you think this particular technology has become integrated into our lives and what we should be looking at and trying to understand about the way we use them?
Well, I got involved in that project in Australia literally because the Telecommunications Association in Australia, at the point where mobile phones were being introduced into Australia, thought that they should do some research on this. So it was literally right at the beginning. I did not have a mobile phone when I started doing this work. And, what's interesting for me is that in this, last year when I was in California, it was the 10th anniversary of the iPhone. And so there was a panel at the Computer History Museum in Mountain View, and I was on that panel. And, I was just stunned that, literally people were blaming the iPhone for everything. I mean, literally, on the way there, the guy who was taking me there, who works at the museum, said to me that, some high school kids in Stanford, at the local Stanford school, commit suicide, and that's why they've now got new fences on the railways at, Palo Alto or something, and that this was to do with the iPhone, and it was again a lesson in this notion of as if a technology comes along and it kind of simply produces these effects. And what really, one of the things that came out of the early mobile phone work, I was quite negative about the mobile phone, I have to say, but clearly the reason that the phone diffused so quickly is that it came into being at a time when actually it met a need, and it met a need, for mothers to be able to talk to their, get in touch with their kids. It met a need in the sense that the labour market was at that point moving to a much more flexible labour market. There were all sorts of things happening in the world where being in touch on a mobile phone was absolutely, it was a great facilitator. And I was very struck, and it was not, I was very negative, I had to say myself, right? But I was very struck when we went around, we did surveys and all sorts of things. People absolutely were positive about it, were talking about how important it was to be away, to be physically away from their partners, but to be able to phone and be in touch. And so I just think with all of these technologies, there's always contradictory effects, and that sure, there are some negative effects of the phone, but I think they've been sort of wonderful as well. And I have to say, my friend Sonia Livingston at the who's in media studies at the LSE, people often say, oh, poor kids, they're always on their screens, and all of this stuff, And Sonia, who works on young people, just says to me, imagine how boring it was to be in the car when you were a kid for hours and hours and hours when your parents, kind of come off it, like, what is this, It
wasn't exactly the golden era of quality family time, was it?
Well, exactly,
Not those journeys anyway. Yeah, exactly. And one of the things you focused on a little bit is coming out from that, I think, is a sort of critical view of this often presented statement that we're all more pressed for time now. This is your most recent book, that somehow life is accelerating. Society is always on. We're always getting emails, having to deal with work, juggle family when we're at work, and you've subjected this to some critical analysis as well. So what have you decided? Is the case here? Are we really more pressed for time?
Well, it's very much a social shaping approach to that question, because I sort of argue in the book, in a sentence actually, that I think the sort of obsession with efficiency and optimization and using every minute of time in a productive way is as much a cultural fixation as it is a technological one, and that again we have all these sets of technologies that suit this kind of cultural obsession. And while I was in Silicon Valley, I decided I would do some work on digital diaries, because everyone's carrying a phone, everyone's got a diary, and I'm sure you all use these diaries all of the time. And I thought it would be a good way of interviewing people about work culture, actually. It wasn't that I was that interested in the diaries, but I was very interested in the, what are the what's the context in which these diaries are used, what are they for? And what came out of my interviews sort of very quickly was how much designers really thought that, if we could just automate these processes, if we could just have fantastic diaries and, everything would be in there, and they'd actually be, there'd be now artificial intelligence, and the diaries would be able to nudge us to do things that we wanted to do. It would be the end of procrastination, this terrible sin, and that you get to the gym. I mean, the other thing that was so classic, right, is that when I looked at all these diaries, and I sort of said, and what non-work items are in these diaries? The one that just absolutely, it was gym, What does that say about a culture?
Yeah. We are fundamentally self-deluding, aren't we, really? I think that's what you're able to prove.
Well, and I mean, if I could just say that this is an old, that this notion that technologies, that automating things and doing things faster will save time goes back to the old discussions about washing machines and dishwashers, and, from the beginning of our discussions about technology, we have just always thought, let's just apply a bit of automation, and this will save us a lot of time. Why don't emails save us time, given that letters took a long time? We've just learnt repeatedly, actually, that there's no simple substitutability in these tasks. And yet I think this fantasy that, now it's the kind of artificial intelligence fantasy and the bots and the Siris, and, that this is really going to save us time and give us a quality life, good quality life.
Yeah.
And spend our time, as one of the designers said to me, and we will then be able to spend our time wisely. We'll get advice from the machines how to spend our time wisely. Yep.
I'd love some instruction on that. It strikes me, and the more you talk about this, that underpinning, really all your work, obviously there is a strong theme around equality, gender equality, broad concerns for social justice, but I think it is remarkable, that there is this really sort of clear concept of sort of individual flourishing and questions of, what a life well lived would look like. I know you don't try and answer that question, but it still seems to be something you keep coming back to. Is that a fair comment?
Well, yes. I'd be very interested in how economists, there's a happiness literature now that I'm quite critical of in economics. So I don't want to go there, but there is actually some very good political philosophy now, as well as economics. Talking about how, part of a good life is actually having discretionary time, that that one shouldn't think about the quality of life only in terms of kind of money and wealth, but that having, free time in the sense of really having time to pursue things that you want to pursue is an important element in the quality of life. And so I've always been very interested in time budget work and time diaries. Who's got time, which groups of people actually gain time because other people are servicing them so that they're able to have the time. What are the gender dimensions of time? How can we distribute work more evenly so we don't live in a society where there's a huge polarisation of working hours, so that some people are working very long hours and there are a lot of people who don't have any work or would like to work more hours. And that sharing out work would be a way of sharing out time. And it seems to me that, I can now refer to proper political philosophy that agrees that an element of social justice is, that discretionary time should be a significant element of justice and a citizen's right, actually. So I'm with Keynes on, the shorter working day.
I want to know what you're doing next. I want to know what's the next book that we're going to see from you, or the next series of articles. What's your current intellectual focus?
Well, I'm writing on these digital diaries at the moment,
Yeah.
so I'm both pursuing how do the diaries affect how we think about time, because it does seem to me that the diaries are kind of mediating. You know, it's about technological mediation, right? And if you think about the mobile phone, we talk about that in terms of mediating communication, that we experience a lot of our communication via text, via phones, you know, via email. And I'm similarly interested in how having a digital diary as the mediator in terms of how we think about the day, you know, even things like the colours on a diary and how they're designed and the spreadsheet look of them and how they were originally thought of as spreadsheets, you know, and I talked to the guy who designed spreadsheets when I was in
Oh, really?
California, and how they were thinking about these things. So I'm interested in that whole notion of how you can automate these things and why you would want to automate these things and what sort of services, you know, what we think should be automated, what should be done by people, those things. And I'm also pursuing a bit the Silicon Valley sort of culture angle, those things. So I'm not sure if it's a book or not.
Okay. We won't hold you to it, don't worry. I'm very aware that the benches are very uncomfortable, and I also want to give all of you time to ask Judy some questions. So I'm going to ask one last question, and you can think of your questions while I'm doing that. I feel this is a slightly inappropriate question because it makes it sound as if you're at the end of your career, and you are not. You've very clearly got a few more very productive decades intellectually ahead of you yet. So don't. This is a bit of a premature question, but if you currently reflected back on your academic career, what are you most proud of to date?
I'm very proud of being part of the development of the field of the social studies of science and technology, STS as we call it. I think that's been a fantastic project to be part of, and is completely flourishing now, all over the place, and you know, generations of young people are doing wonderful, wonderful work on various aspects of technology, and also I think have made the argument that gender is always embedded in technology, and hopefully that is now a standard and accepted argument. So I'd say those two things, really.
I think you deserve to be proud of both of those, very definitely. So maybe we could just give Judy a little round of applause if we can.